real quick as we dive in, I mentioned this with other materials that I talk about. I had to read this book like maybe some of you did or were supposed to. Back in high school, I was a junior in high school when I had to read this in class. And it's funny looking in the same book where my own handwriting as a 16-year-old is still written in the cover. And now 20 some odd years later, 23 years later, yikes, coming back to a book like this that I haven't read in so long, I'm a different person. And the book is very different for me now. Just like last semester I talked how Hamlet is that same way. When you read it at various intervals of your life, it's amazing how much the book actually changes. When I was in high school, I remember, this is, like most of us, we think, this is a book that tries to tie together history with a story. And that's true. But there's so much more now that I'm older and I've been around longer. I know more about human nature, and the book means a lot more to me at this stage of my life. So the point of all that is to say, maybe you read something in high school, maybe you're supposed to read something now, but just because we won't be in college for very long, try your best not to forget these books of the past, because as you get older and you come back to them, you'll find new and interesting things about them, and even more importantly, new and interesting things about yourself. So just because we do this in college, don't think that these kinds of books are only meant for the classroom. Try and pick them up at various points in your life. You'll get a lot more out of them. I was thinking about this. I don't do this on purpose, but I was looking back over my notes from the other day and looking at my notes for today. And by the end of today, I will have talked about the following subject areas. All right? Literature and mythology, film and television, sports, psychology, sociology, history, philosophy, politics, economics, geography, and theology. So that's how my brain works. When I read something, my brain instantly tries to make connections to all the other things that I like. I like all those other things. Hopefully, though, that it's helpful for me, but I hope it's helpful for you, so that even if you're not the biggest fan of old literature, maybe by circumstance and fortune, I will have landed on some piece that you are connected to. Maybe your particular major or something else that you're interested in your own personal life, that we can try and make a connection and make this book a little more valuable for you as well. So keep track of those. That's why I have so many books in front of me, is because I'm always pulling things from other sources. So keep track as we go and see if anything clicks with you. Before we dive into the actual text, I wanted to show you sort of a cool map. I know you can't see it, but when I post it, you'll be able to see it. I'll come back here for a minute. So a guy built a website where he put the geography of the book actually into a map. I don't know exactly how accurate it is, but according to the text, this seems to be where he envisioned that things would be. So this is the French side over here. And down here at the bottom is the Bastille, which shows up in our text. And right above it over here is La Force prison, which is where Darnay is held at the end. And right in between on this road right here is where the Farge wine shop is, where the casks spill and blood is written on the wall. And way up here on the other end of town is where the Evermond estate is. So we can see the separation between the rich people and the prisoners down here. And then there's the Seine River in the middle. So it's interesting if you're someone who needs a visual orientation of what's going on in this book and where is all this happening in Paris. This is at least one artist's envisioning of that. What he also did is he actually, when you map it into the real geography of the city of Paris, it flips a little bit so it follows the river right here, but that's actually where the book would take place. So again, it's just flipped sideways. Here's the Bastille down here, and here's the famous street from chapter 5. So the roads actually come in here, and if you look closely underneath this rendering, it splits, and there's the road right there that actually fits with the novel. So it's kind of cool to think, well, yes, this is a story, and it's It's rather historical, but how accurate is it actually? Well, at least the geography is pretty darn close. So you can play around with that. It's kind of a fun little website if you like things to be visualized for you and going beyond the text. The other day we discussed how the book was put together and maybe how we should start to read it. That was the how day. Today, as I mentioned, is the why day. Why should we care about this book that's 170 years old? Why should we think that these themes are still relevant for us? That's what we're going to cover today. And the first biggie is the idea of justice. If you remember from our history discussions the last 2 weeks, we heard the idea of the general will. Mr. Harris talked a lot about that. And it was the highest standard. The Constitution of 1791 stipulated, this is from Sister Revolutions, that there is no authority in France higher than the law. Which is a little bit scary because we have some other interpretations of that. But we see how justice is carried out wrongfully throughout this book, and it happens on both sides. So we see the injustices occur when Manette and Darnay, the protagonists of our story, are obviously wrongfully imprisoned because they're perceived to be agents agents against the state. So they're imprisoned by the agents of the state. And then the revolutionaries act unjustly toward the state and anyone else who gets in their way. So there's justice from the top down. There's injustice from the top down. There's injustice rising back up from the bottom up. And no one seems to have the best idea of how we should be behaving ourselves in a just way. So that's what's covered in our Sister Revolutions book very well. Let me repeat a couple things that maybe you didn't notice in our chapters from last week. Interesting quotes. Everything must be allowed to those who are headed in the same direction as the revolution. Thus, all forms of repression, persecution, and violence could hide behind the mask of revolutionary law. Illegality was necessarily consubstantial with the revolution. All right? In order to have a revolution, we must break the law, is essentially what we're saying there. We also see how this plays out, and this sounds like it's directly out of Dickens on the next page, 158. The first law of terror enacted in March 1793 called for indiscriminate arrest and summary justice. This is where the trials in the book go to. Individuals accused of infractions against the revolution were assumed to be guilty and had to prove their innocence. They had no right to trial by jury and no right of appeal. But they were granted speedy trials. All those arrested had to be tried and executed within 24 hours. So when we see that this was actually going on, we can understand in the text where they're just filing people through the courtroom and they're like, guilty, 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 sentenced to death, sentenced to death. This was actually going on. The scary thing is when the legislature starts to blend with the judiciary. We've been talking about how our system keeps those separate, and this is why. We hear from Montesquieu back in Sister Revolutions as well. As he had observed, when the judiciary is absorbed into the legislature's power over citizens' lives and freedom becomes arbitrary. It's just whoever is in control at that moment. There's no set rules for anyone to follow. So, what we see is a guy like Robespierre. He says, revolutionary government had displaced constitutional government and public freedom had eclipsed the freedom of the individual. He says this, under a constitutional regime, it suffices to protect individuals against abuses by the public power. Yeah, that's true. That's a good thing. But under a revolutionary regime, see how it gets flipped. The public power, which becomes the revolutionaries, itself is obliged to defend itself against all the factions that attack it. So again, the injustice that they're complaining about from the previous rule gets inverted, and they end up doing the exact same thing to the people that they're supposedly trying to liberate. We see how these philosophies mirror some of the things we've already been talking about. Towards the end of the book, in Book 3, we see examples of utilitarian thinking. pretty clearly. Let me just give you a couple quick sentences. When they're talking to Dr. Manette, they say, "As to what is dearer to you than life, nothing can be so dear to a good citizen as the Republic. The Republic, the greater good, is more important than individual people and families." We see it a few pages later as we get near the end of the book. "The good physician of the Republic would deserve better still of the Republic by rooting out an obnoxious family of aristocrats, and would doubtless feel a sacred glow and joy in making his daughter a widow and her child an orphan. There was wild excitement, patriotic fervor, and not a touch of human sympathy." So again, the idea that we've covered already with utilitarianism, that there is a greater good, and it doesn't matter who gets in your way. If it needs to be we need to take violent action, so be it. It's for the greater good. And everything becomes a measurement. Right? It's like we put people on scales and say, well, this is more important, so it doesn't matter what happens to them. And so we can see the philosophies we've been talking about, how when they run amok, this is what happens. The idea of utilitarianism also shows up in another of Dickens' books, just real quickly, that I talk about in my class of the history of the novel. We talk about the novel Hard Times, which is actually his shortest book, so we can zip through it pretty quickly in that semester. But it also has characters in it that are constantly weighing the greater good. So there's business owners and schoolmasters who are constantly saying, well, what's the most important value for all of us? Not what you think is true, not what you think is good. It's always about the larger community. So just another book recommendation for you. We might think, oh, well, this is old stuff. This is referencing something 200 years ago. These things don't still occur. I don't know if you've been watching some of the news lately, but there have been some riots in various cities. There was one in Portland, I think, recently. There's footage of this little old guy and little old lady driving, and people like bashing on their car and pulling them out, and just wild stuff. I mean, these are people who have nothing to do with anything. They're just strolling through, and they're getting mobbed by incredibly angry people. And I'm going to offer a quote to you that I don't want you to read too far into it. I just want to show you the truth of it. In responding to some of those outbursts of civil unrest, Hillary Clinton said on television, "You cannot be civil with a political party that wants to destroy what you stand for, what you care about." That's her interpretation of the other side. "That's why I believe if we are fortunate enough to win back the House and or the Senate, that's when civility can start again." So the ends justify the means. "Violence now, and we promise we'll be peaceful when we're in charge." Sure. That sounds exactly like something Robespierre would say. So whenever I can connect a current politician to someone like Robespierre, it's a good day. If someone on the other side would have said that, just to cover my bases, I would have repeated the same quote. I have no allegiance to any of them. I mostly despise all politicians, so I'm not picking on her. So back to sister revolutions. Here's what Edmund Burke, the English conservative, you might call him, he said, "I shall rejoice," commented the great foe of the French Revolution. He didn't like it. As he lamented the degradation of legal rights and the disappearance of justice across the Channel, "in seeing a judicial power established in France," this is what he's hoping for, "when they are not called upon to put any man to his trial upon undefined crimes of state, when victims shall not be snatched from the fury of the people to be brought before a tribunal itself, subject to the effects of the same fury, I shall rejoice in seeing such a happy order established in France." What is this order that we're talking about? In the book, this image comes from the book Maps of Meaning, which is a very, very dense book on mythology and how it plays out in our individual psychology as well as in social construction, social psychology. And so this is a really rudimentary image that really makes a good point about the difference between what order might look like and what happens when things get out of control. So what the image shows, and these are, again, ancient mythological archetypes, is we have this vision of, or this image of what you might consider a father figure, the king figure. It's the masculine side of mythology. There's a feminine side too. It just so happens because we're dealing with government and social institutions and laws and things like that. That happens to be the male side of it. But what's interesting about the idea of and how these get played out in ancient stories is that there's this sense of order. We need to have this, obviously. But it can always go two ways. Order is good. It provides security and stability, protection, safety, all those nice things that we like. But we also know that when it goes too far, it turns into tyranny, oppression, further injustice. So there's a delicate balance between whatever this order is. We have to have it. We need these social institutions. We need government. We talked about that with our discussions of Locke and others. But what happens when it starts going too far? That's when we slip down into something called chaos. So this has been talked about for millennia. This is ancient archetypal stuff. But it plays out in our history and it plays out in our literature, that this is what the people of France in our novel are struggling with. They want order, but it's moved towards tyranny, and so they have to do something about it. Now, when we go down to chaos, which is why I signify it as a dragon, because in ancient stories it was usually a dragon or some sort of monster, you got to go down and you got to fight it. You got to face it. Well, what's down there? Well, we see in our novel that chaos is mostly violence, and we'll cover that a little bit more. But what always happens is when you go down there and you face it, you bring something back with you. That's what the ancient stories tell you. Usually in those stories, you know, the monster is living in some cave and he has gold in his cave, and the hero has to go slay the monster and get the gold and take it back to the kingdom so everyone can be happy. There's always something positive down here, even though it's dangerous and scary. But what happens in our novel and what happened in the actual revolution is when it descends into chaos, what gets replaced? Well, it's actually, for a while, it's not order. It's actually more tyranny. That's what we were just talking about. So the tyranny of the state gets just simply replaced by the tyranny of a different kind of state, the tyranny of the revolutionaries. So these are ancient stories that are completely true because they've been lived, but they show up in our novel and in our historical studies. So we always need this, and we always need chaos. We always need things to change. But the question is, well, what happens when you emerge from the chaos? Where are you going to go? Is it going to turn into something orderly and peaceful? Or is it going to turn back into tyranny and oppression? And we see from people like Robespierre where that ends up going. So this is a book about negotiating the difference between order and chaos, the oppressive tyranny of government and then the murderous mayhem of people who are run amok. I think what we can notice from our previous couple weeks when Mr. Harris was talking about the comparison of our system, or even when Dr. Munsell was here, I think we can kind of see how the American revolutionaries tried to mitigate this problem, right? We need a good government, obviously, and we need it to provide safety and security for us so that we can live our lives. But it also can't go too far. It has to have enough freedom to it, enough liberty. It allows people to be creative and do their own individual things so that it doesn't become oppressive. So there's the distinction. So when we fought our war, well, we pretty quickly figured out what had gone wrong, and we knew why we were fighting it. And we fixed that when we started to build our own country. France it took longer for them. They were stuck in the realm of chaos for quite a bit longer. So again, these ideas from history or from literature, these are not new. These are not brand new things. These have been around for thousands and thousands of years. So when you get stuck in the realm of chaos, what's something else that this book does a good job of identifying? Well, what happens in mobs and crowds? The French sociologist Gustave Le Bon, he wrote about crowds and what happens to people's minds when they get wrapped up in crowds. And his ideas were kind of revolutionary because he actually predates Freud. And so He's the first one to look at how people's minds change when they're around other people. And he says there's basically three characteristics of a crowd. And he says, one, people feel stronger than they otherwise would be. There's strength in numbers, let's say. He says that crowds have a contagious quality to them. The emotions spread quickly from one person to the next and from one group to the next. There's a contagious quality to it. And then third, crowds can be manipulated because they're based almost entirely on emotion. There's not a lot of thinking going on. And so emotions can be manipulated, they spread quickly, and it leads to people thinking they're stronger and more powerful than they otherwise would be. So that's sort of his basic definition of what crowds do. But what also happens, or a more detailed description of what happens, is called deindividuation. Any of you in your social psych classes, you'll probably hear about that word. Deindividuation is where you lose yourself in a crowd. So, a couple examples. If you look at book 2 there. Brilliant description from Dickens where he says, "The sea of black and threatening waters and of destructive upheaving of wave against wave, whose depths were yet unfathomed and whose forces were yet unknown, the remorseless sea of turbulently swaying shapes, voices of vengeance, and faces hardened in the furnaces of suffering until the touch of pity could make no mark on them." So just a really quick example of how you don't become a person anymore. You're just lost in a faceless sea of anger, and you've lost your identity. We see this with the Jacquerie, the three characters that come to hang out at the Farge's shop, that they no longer have names, that they just become number 1, number 2, and number 3. They're losing their own personal identity. So again, when that happens, people start to act in ways that they normally wouldn't. Here's another quick definition from Le Bon. And it often doesn't matter who the people are, because they figure out a way to come together. He says, "Whoever be the individuals that compose it, however like or unlike be in their mode of life, their occupations, their character, their intelligence, the fact that they have been transformed into a crowd puts them in possession of a sort of collective mind, which makes them feel, think, and act in a manner quite different from that in which each individual of them would act if he were in isolation. There are certain ideas and feelings which do not come into being or do not transform themselves into acts except in the case of individuals forming a crowd." So again, would people really be this violent if it were just them on the streets? Probably not. Probably not. We see another example whenever I think about the idea of de-individuation, not only from this book, but if any of you had to read To Kill a Mockingbird back in high school, there's a great scene of de-individuation in that book where, if you remember, Atticus is staying out late to protect the jail because he's afraid that people in the town are going to lynch Tom for what he's accused of doing. So Scout and Jem are like, where's Dad? Where's Atticus tonight? And so they go wander through the streets and they find him at the jail. And sure enough, by the time they get there, a whole crowd of people, angry townsfolk, have arrived, and they're saying, "Atticus, let us at him. Get out of the way. We want our justice against that man." And what Scout does, what's such an interesting thing that highlights de-individuation, of pulling an individual out of a crowd, is she notices one of the men in front of the jail because it's the father of a boy she goes to school with. And she says, "Mr. Cunningham, how you doing? What are you doing here tonight?" And he kind of ignores her, and she keeps talking and talking, because she does through a lot of the book. She keeps kind of asking him these questions, and finally he can't take it anymore, and he acknowledges her and has a conversation with her. And suddenly he is no longer part of the group. He's an individual. She called him by his name, and now he has to answer to her. And he's no longer part of the angry group, and eventually he says, "All right, boys, it's getting late. Let's go home for the night." And the crowd disperses. So we act in ways that are not good when we're part of a crowd. We actually lose our identity. And what happens is we become really, really stupid. That's exactly what happens. Laban says this: in the collective mind, the intellectual aptitudes of the individuals, and in consequence their individuality, are weakened. The unconscious qualities obtain the upper hand. We stop thinking. They can never accomplish acts demanding a high degree of intelligence. In crowds, it is stupidity and not wit that is accumulated. The conscious personality has entirely vanished. Will and discernment are lost. So when God gives us the ability to reason, when we put ourselves in those situations, our reason falls away and we're led completely by emotion, and that's when we make the worst choices of all. Now, don't get me wrong, it's obviously good to be part of a group. We have athletes here. That's why you wear a team uniform. You're part of a group. That's why soldiers wear uniforms and have the same haircut, because you are giving up a part of yourself to strengthen the group. That's totally normal. But again, what happens is if you allow your morality, your individual values to be reduced, and you just go along with the crowd, examples like what we see in this novel are what tend to occur. We have to know our breaking point. What else happens when we get caught up in mob psychology? Well, we end up dehumanizing people, something else that Dickens portrays in the novel. It becomes easier to view other groups of people as enemies if you view them less than human. There are lots of references to animals in the book. When I started noticing, I was underlining constantly. For example, when the Marquis tells Darnay how he hopes to uphold the class system for the elites, there's that Marxist reference that we talked about the other day. He says, "We will keep the dogs obedient to the whip." In one of the chapters where Dickens describes the villagers beginning to rise up, he says, "They are changed into wild beasts. As frenzied villagers gather outside the prison walls, they're described as howling with beastly excitement, and almost like zombies out for blood. They're becoming less than human." And by the conclusion, the villagers themselves even refer to themselves as dogs. They kind of wear it as a point of pride, but they've also become that themselves. Towards the end of the book, in numerous lines, "I'm a crazed young common dog. We were so robbed by that man who stands there as all we common dogs are by those superior beings. The rights of these nobles to harness us as common dogs to carts." Common dog, repeated. So, again, it's easier to be violent with each other when we don't actually see God's image. We don't see the divinity of each individual person. We see this eventually played out in a really obvious and visually graphic way when we arrive at something like World War II. And we see, I know you can't quite see, but where Nazi propaganda showed Jews as rats or insects to be exterminated and squashed and killed. What's interesting, though, is the Nazi propaganda from their side actually portrayed them as animals as well, as this big, strong eagle, these talons that will help destroy the vermin of Europe. Another book that I teach in my novel class actually embraces the idea of how humans turn into animals when they treat each other this way. And we studied the book, or we did in semesters past, the book Mouse by Art Spiegelman, which is a book about a guy whose father lived through the Holocaust, and he's hearing his father's stories, and he portrays the characters in the book as animals to prove a point of how horrible it became. So this is what happens in the book and in real life when we don't abide by justice, when we don't know what truth is, when we let ourselves get emotionally carried away for some political cause. It becomes very, very violent and dangerous. Just as an interesting side note to all this about the era that we're talking about, French Revolution becomes this creative dark period, which is actually pretty common. This happens throughout various portions of history. In Sister Revolutions, again, this is what it says. It says, "Hollow talk about aristocrats, traitors, conspiracies, virtue, and virile energy enervated speech as well as political thought. Ironically, the incendiary, energetic, revolutionary language had devolved into a feeble, vacuous one that conveyed neither truth nor reason, nor any meaningful political or moral insights. Indeed, no masterpieces of French literature were produced during the years of the Revolution. No gripping novels, no witty plays, no insightful essays, no great poetry. The language itself seemed depleted. So these effects are not just political or legal. They're not just social in how we engage with each other as individuals. They actually ruin our creativity, because if our brains are occupied by hating each other, it's really hard to create anything beautiful or of value outside of hatred. And so, again, this happens at various points in history, so I thought it was interesting that our text actually refers to the fact that the creative well had gone dry because people were preoccupied with other dangerous ideas. Ultimately, what all good literature should do is figure out what is true here. What's the truth? Because the truth is what lasts for millennia. You know, that's the Greek stories last, Shakespeare lasts, we have these novels from the 19th century, they last, but they wouldn't last if they weren't in some way true. So we got to figure out what's the truth. I think, if I remember right, you guys read Oedipus in your first class, which is a great play. So what's the truth of that play, and why does it last so long? Well, it's about if you're unwilling to learn about yourself, to face who you really are, you end up blind and alone. That's exactly what happens. Because if you don't know who you are, you don't know where you're supposed to go. And if you don't know where you're going, you end up alone and blind and lost. That's how that play ends. That's true. That's why it's still around today. We read Hamlet last semester, and we hopefully remember what is true about that book. It's when you face suffering, like Hamlet's father dying and the kingdom is all in disarray. When you're unsure of what to do, if you resort to nihilism and meaninglessness, what happens? Everyone dies. That's what happens. That's exactly true. Because if you can't find meaning in anything, then you view your actions as meaningless. And if you harm in some way yourself, it's not such a big leap to start harming others. And so at the end of that play, the stage is littered with dead people. Because if everything's meaningless, this is what happens. It's completely true. So we might think, well, what's the truth of this book? Well, I think some of the closing lines can offer us some really good eternal truths. At the end, in chapter 15 of book 3, a great line: crush humanity out of shape once more, under similar hammers, and it will twist itself into the same tortured forms. Sow the same seed of rapacious license and oppression over again, and it will surely yield the same fruit according to its kind. In other words, when you oppress people, when you don't treat people like individuals, they're going to react. And this is what happens, and it happens over and over again. When you try to crush humanity, when you try to control them, when you try to put them in boxes, and you don't recognize them as individuals, this is what we get. But there's other truths too. We see the idea of vengeance being a key theme in this book. And it, of course, presents itself in the most disturbing way in the character of Madame Defarge. But what we see is that the vengeance in this character and in real life, it just perpetuates itself. It never gets solved. And in fact, your vengeance and your anger and your fighting back is actually a sign of weakness, not strength. The German sociologist Helmut Schick says this, says the idea of compensatory violence, a substitute activity for what is productive, hence itself a result of impotence. Instead of doing something positive about it, you just go to destruction. That's your choice. The sadist, the wantonly destructive vandal, is explicable in these terms: sadistic pleasure and destruction as a substitute for positive activity, either denied or of which the subject is incapable, is seen as the necessary outcome of an unlived and crippled life. Ernest Becker, who I talked about last year with Hamlet, he says this: once you have your whole life striving on a desperate lie and try to implement that lie, try to make the world just the opposite of what it is, then you instrument your own undoing. All you do is make things worse. Your vengeance never makes things any better. And the reason why is because it's never just an act against that one person, right? Here's what Madame Defarge does in the novel. This is who she becomes. Imbued from her childhood with a brooding sense of wrong and an inveterate hatred of a class, opportunity had developed her into a tigress. Again, not human. She was absolutely without pity. If she had ever had the virtue in her, it had quite gone out of her. It was nothing to her that an innocent man was to die for the sins of his forefathers. She saw not him, but them. It was nothing to her that his wife was to be made a widow and his daughter an orphan. That was insufficient punishment because they were her natural enemies and her prey, again, animal, and as such had no right to live. Here's the weakness part. To appeal to her was made hopeless by her having no sense of pity even for herself. Again, vengeance is never against just one person, right? So that's the story of Cain and Abel. It's not that Cain is mad at Abel. It's that he's mad at God, right? He's mad at the very idea of being. And that's why he acts out. So even killing his brother wouldn't satisfy his anger, because he's always going to be mad at God and the nature of being. And that would never stop. Which is why God has to mark him so that it does stop, so that it doesn't keep perpetuating itself, because that's the truth. That's what happens. So, the other day I talked about some flaws, and one of them I mentioned was that it's disputed if this book is completely historically accurate. Does it follow the actual facts and timeline of real history? And maybe not completely. But thinking about that and thinking about how truths show up, it reminds me of a little anecdote about a rabbi and his student. And the student is diligently studying the Torah. And while he's studying, though, the ancient stories and the mythologies and these historical accounts are just confusing to him. He can't quite wrap his brain around how these can possibly be true. And so he goes to his rabbi and he says, "Rabbi, are you telling me that all the things that I'm reading about in these early books of Scripture, that they're actually true?" And the rabbi's response is, did these actually happen? And the rabbi says, this is what always happens. So whether it's factually true or not may be important, but it might not be. Because the truth is in the fact that this is what happens. So that's what these good pieces of literature teach us. This is how human nature is. This is the truth of our life. Those other pieces you've read in other semesters, they end on a bit of a down note. I mean, as you remember, they're not exactly the most uplifting pieces you could read. But Tale of Two Cities is a little bit different. It offers us a solution. When we've got all these horrible things that people are doing, when we're caught in the midst of violence and anger and vengeance, our book actually offers the answer. And we see it in the phrase "recalled to life." When you see something that shows up in the very first few pages of a book and it shows up in the last few pages of a book, it's kind of a big neon sign saying, hey, this is the key idea of this story. You might want to pay attention to this. So, it's not exactly subtle, the idea of being recalled to life. I mentioned at the end of last class that some people might envision a version of heaven on earth. What might that actually look like? And our text gives a pretty good example, I think. As Carton is walking to his death, he says, "I see a beautiful city and a brilliant people rising from its abyss. And in their struggles to be truly free and their triumphs and defeats through long years to come, I see the evil of this time and of the previous time of which this is the natural birth, gradually making expiation, atonement, for itself and wearing out." The goal is to see these sins that people commit start to diminish. that people change for the better and not keep repeating the same mistakes of history. So how do we attain this beautiful city? Well, the answer is in the last few lines of the book. When Carton says, it's a far, far better thing that I do that I have ever done, it's a far, far better thing, a rest that I go to than I've ever known, we can hear the echoes of Paul. The solution that's offered at the end of our book is sacrifice. It's choosing to take on the suffering of other people. That's what Carton does at the end. And that's what much of our scripture is based on. So if you look at passages from Philippians, the famous one where, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Or in Galatians, Paul repeats, I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. So this is what our whole faith is based on. It's what friendship is based on. It's giving yourself to another person. It's being able someday to call up a friend you had long ago, and even though you haven't talked to that person in 10 years, you call them up and say, hey, I'm struggling. I have a problem I can't quite figure out. What do you think? And without missing a beat, that person says, yeah, I'll help you. I'll do whatever you want. That's what offering yourself means. It's our faith, it's our friendship, it's marriage. It's what it is. I went to a Christian college. I know what marriage, what people think it is. Okay, I get it. It's the romance, and it's a fairy tale, and it's posting pictures on Instagram. It's none of that stuff. It's none of it. It's nonsense. It's this. This is what that is. It's saying the suffering of the world is going to be upon us. It's inevitable. You can't escape it. I know we're going to face sickness and sadness and disappointment and death. It's coming. It's going to be for all of us. But I'll never flake out. I'm not going anywhere. You can trust me. That's what happens. Hopefully the other person says it back to you, that they have the guts to say, yes, I will bear whatever problems come up for you too. And so together, you can go face the world and say, well, at least together, we're not going to make things worse. Ideally, we can at least accomplish that because we're stronger together. And maybe if we work hard enough, we could even help the people around us as well. But that's what it is. So when Carton says at the end, he says, it's a far better thing that I do than I've ever done. Yeah, that's exactly right. When you offer yourself as a life offering to take up the burdens of other people, it's the best thing you could ever possibly do. It is the answer. So, even though Carton, throughout most of the book, doesn't think his life has a lot of value, he's kind of the brooding, dark, anti-hero almost throughout much of the book. But he finally comes around. And by the end, he's realized what his purpose is. It's to sacrifice himself for the good of other people. Dickens has another line in one of his other stories where he says, no one is useless in this world who lightens the burden of it to anyone else. So we see some of these themes come back around about heroism and offering yourself in several of Dickens' books. So I started the other day with a sign that hangs on my door in my office about being brave and true. And throughout the book we see several examples of these characters being recalled to life, particularly Manette and Darnay, right? That someone else is going to pull them from the grips of impending death, right? They're saving their lives. The slang term that we see in the text, along with the idea of being recalled to life, was, if you remember, it's resurrection man, right? That's the sort of Yeah, it's a slang term for these people that are going out to rescue people in some way or another. But hopefully it's obvious. Dickens isn't exactly subtle in showing us that, yeah, we've all been rescued too. I hope we can see that. That we've been saved from death. And if you don't know that, I'm very glad you're at this school. I'm glad you're in this class today. But we all need to recognize that someone offered himself so that we could be resurrected. And so perhaps that should be our goal too, to become resurrection men and women for other people. It's a pretty good lesson for a book, and I don't think anything could be more brave and true than that. So that's A Tale of Two Cities.